Hello, viewers, and welcome to what promises to be a fascinating conversation. As many of you know, Watchtower facilities, including the headquarters complex in Warwick, upstate New York, are referred to among Jehovah's Witnesses as Bethels, and those who volunteer to staff these buildings are known as Bethelites. Here to share their experiences in the organization's inner sanctum are two former Bethelites who both left the organization in fairly recent years. Jordan Johnson, who runs the JW Rebuttal YouTube channel, and Cliff Henderson, known to many of you as Ex-JW Fifth. Jordan and Cliff, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Lloyd. It's awesome to be here.
Thanks a lot, Lloyd. Great to be on the channel again.
It's just wonderful to have you both on. Cliff, you've been on before. Jordan, you are new on the scene. You burst onto the scene with your own channel, telling some interesting, well, fascinating stories, quite frankly, about your time in Bethel. We were just talking off camera, and you were both saying that, Cliff, you were at Bethel from the end of 2007 to the beginning of 2009. Jordan, you were at Bethel for a 2-month stint in 2013, and then you were at Bethel from 2014 through 2016. So that gives us quite a large time period. If I understand, Cliff, you were at Wallkill branch. I think that's the office of the United States branch. And Jordan, you were in Brooklyn, and you were part of the staff that transferred to Warwick.
Yep, that's correct.
Wonderful. So I actually have here, I was showing this to Jordan before, Cliff. I don't want to trigger you too much, but I have here a book which you are both quite familiar with, probably. Dwelling Together in Unity. It's basically the rule book for Bethelites and has some fascinating little instructions in there. It seems to be quite a regimented life in Bethel. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And as you can see, you know, having just the general rules of Jehovah's Witness life, that alone was not enough. They had to create this additional manual because when you're a Bethelite, you're held to another standard, higher than what everyone else on the outside has to comply with. So it's very extremely regimented. Everything is based on you have to be at certain places. You know, you have a very full and, dare I say, hectic schedule many times as a Bethelite.
Jordan, does that square with your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it triggered a memory when you were talking about how regimented it is. I heard of an experience once of a guy who had come to Bethel. He was studying at the time. He had been a former military, and he does his trip around Bethel to see how it's like, and he ends up cutting off his study because he saw that Bethel was almost exactly the same way as it was when he was in the military.
Wow.
And he's like, I'm not going to leave one military-like organization to go to another military-like organization.
Incredible. So what misconceptions do you think most Jehovah's Witnesses have when it comes to what life in Bethel is like?
Well, one thing that I could say, and I feel like this happens at different levels of the organization. For example, I think as Jehovah's Witnesses in general, many times we didn't let non-witnesses into some of the issues that Jehovah's Witnesses that we would experience, like in the congregations or some of the difficulties. And I feel like it's kind of like that at every level. You know, if you're a pioneer, you have to tell the rest of the Jehovah's Witnesses that pioneer life is great and there's no problems. If you're an elder, it feels like it's kind of like that at every level. That's been my experience. So I remember being at Bethel, and I came in and, encountered some interesting attitudes. Like, for example, there was this guy there that he had been there for 6 months, but he had got a level of authority. And so when I walked in, he was already kind of, well, you're a new guy and everything. And then later I found out it was 6 months. And I'm like, we've pretty much been here the same amount of time. Right? But, I remember calling my sister And I called her up and I was like, yeah, there was this guy that he was acting like this and like that. And she was like, wait a minute, at Bethel? And that's when I remembered. I was like, oh, that's right. We don't tell them these stories. Like, this is all kind of an in-house type of thing. So just kind of answering your question directly, I think the misconception is that, it's just this other level, this other caliber of person and of Jehovah's Witness even that's there that doesn't have some of these little petty issues that, a Jehovah's Witness may experience just in their congregation or dealing with other witnesses on a day-to-day basis.
Jordan, does that chime with your experience?
I have to laugh because that's exactly where my mind went to when you were asking about misconceptions. In fact, that was a joke amongst a bunch of us where we would say Bethel sucks. It really kind of sucks to be here at Bethel sometimes, but you would never, ever, ever mention that to anybody outside of Bethel, because the stories you tell people, it's a spiritual paradise. And all we do is we float on clouds and our job assignment's easy. And we were with these giants who spent all their time talking about, the Bible and studying and reading. That's what you portray to people on the outside. But when you're in it, there's just, and I think I mentioned earlier too, Bethel becomes the grind in addition to all the other junk that you have to put up with sometimes.
Indeed. I can just speaking from the outside, I visited the London Bethel, I visited Patterson and Brooklyn. And my perception was that it was a very kind of sterile atmosphere. Everything was like hyper clean, needlessly clean, cleaner than a hospital. And everyone seemed to be very orderly in the way they were comporting themselves. There wasn't a great deal of, fun and laughter. It was just lots of kind of seriousness. And my experience with people who visited Bethel before I went to the American Bethels, they would come back and say, oh, it's this spiritual paradise. You go to Brooklyn and it's almost like you're entering another world that's cut off from the real world, and everyone's so nice and so spiritual. You can sense the spirituality when you're talking to them. And you guys are telling me that that's just not the case.
No, not at all.
So one thing I thought would be really interesting would be to do just kind of like a quick fire experiences and stories from your periods in Bethel. So perhaps if we start with you, Jordan, do you have any interesting anecdotes to share?
Yeah, so it just came to my mind. One of the biggest things that you talk about when you're at Bethel is how it's awesome to be around spiritual giants, people who had been at Bethel for 20, 30, 40, 50 years sometimes. Having that one-on-one experience with them was great. And so I remember this memory I had of a brother, Victor Marcy is his name. He'd been at Bethel for, I think, pushing 50 years, if not already at that mark when I spoke with him. I had a duty one night where I was watching the tower's door to not let any, intruders get in. And he came to sit with me and he wanted to chat for a little bit. And he had some stories about how he said that 3 Bethel office brothers had barged into his room one day and had stripped him down naked and made him take a shower. And at the time, you're just thinking, there's no way that they had done this to this brother. He's been here for so long. And he told all these stories about mistreatment that he'd received by Bethel office brothers. And it's probably a little bit of cognitive dissonance where you're just thinking there's just no absolute way that he's been treated this way. And then he tells stories from when he was a young man, his first 2 or 3 years at Bethel, where he'd have to work in the bindery and his hands would have cuts on them where he was just bleeding all over the books as they were going out, and they wouldn't let him take breaks and all this other stuff. And so my experience with the old timers, for the most part, you would hear their stories about how great Bethel has been. But every now and again, you'd find these 1 or 2 brothers who had kind of gone off their rockers a little bit. And you just know that they would never be able to survive outside of Bethel. And it was interesting to see how Bethel makes people dependent on them when they've been there for so long.
It's almost like what you're describing. There's a scene in the Shawshank Redemption where this old prisoner is released and he tries to kind of get stuck into normal life. I think he takes a job in a supermarket, but pretty soon they find him hanging in his apartment. He just cannot. He was used to living in those kind of squalid conditions, and it was all he knew. Do you think there's an element of that with some of the old timers in Bethel?
Oh yeah, and they would some people would say that, if a brother was acting kind of weird, they'd say, oh, he's one of those that, he's been here so long that you just know he can never be able to survive outside of Bethel.
Wow.
They had long outlived their quote unquote usefulness to Bethel, and they just kind of spent their days sitting in their rooms and being taken care of. And you just knew that if it were really up to Bethel office, they wouldn't have them there anymore because they weren't really contributing anything to Bethel anymore.
Wow. And Cliff, do you have any interesting stories to share?
Well, I was actually just what Jordan just shared kind of made me think of something that happened when I first got there. So when I first got to Bethel at the end of 07 and maybe the beginning of, even the beginning of 08, I believe that was one of the primary waves of reassignment, as they called it, right? Which reassignment essentially means layoff, but they use the word reassignment. You're not getting assigned to anything except go. Maybe you can go and pioneer. Hopefully you can go and pioneer, or sometimes maybe as a special pioneer or something like that. But, kind of as Jordan was talking about, you get these guys that have been there for for a really long time, and many of them speak glowingly about the organization. But every once in a while, you'll catch someone in a moment of honesty and they'll tell you, how they really feel. So I remember like probably my first couple of weeks at Bethel, I was in the elevator. And I'm just excited to be there. Coming to Bethel had been my dream. Like all of my passwords on my email addresses were like Bethelites since I was like 11. Nobody can steal my identity off that information.
You had a custom-made T-shirt saying Bethelite. Right. Yeah,
exactly. So I'm just happy, and I'm meeting everybody. I was in the elevator with this one. I almost said sister, but it is what it is, I guess. With this one lady, that had been there for years, and I was like, "Hey, good morning. My name is Cliff." And I'm, introducing myself, and she had this look of fear on her face. And I was like, "How are you doing?" She's like, "Every day you wake up, you never know if your name is going to get called, and you're going to be sent out there to go and try to figure out how to live." And I had never met this person before in my life, but when I saw that and I started paying attention, I'm like, wow, this whole idea that you would hear at the assemblies, like, yeah, Jehovah gave us a great assignment, and now we're in the field, or now we're just working as pioneers, and we're trying to make ends meet in these different ways. Like, people were terrified. I started to realize that people, and it's not the guys that were there from 19 to 22, right? That's not the guys that are thinking like, what is going to happen after I leave? It's the people that have been there for decades and who don't have any outside work experience or just outside human experience, if you will, because the life of a Bethelite is so different. So you can imagine, these people at 50 years old or whatever ages, and they're just being put out. And it's like, first of all, figure out how to work, figure out how to pay rent, balance the checkbook, and all this stuff. And it was very nerve-wracking for people. That's something that I noticed right away.
That must have been really heightened during the period recently where you had all the Bethel layoffs. It was announced at a kind of fateful morning worship that there would be significant reductions in branch personnel. And
I was there for that announcement.
Oh, you were there for that announcement?
I was there for that announcement. Mm-hmm.
So what was the mood like when that announcement was made?
At first, they were talking about holding on to Brooklyn up until even as late as 2020, 2021. So at first, people were thinking, we'll be okay. We're going to need extra staffing for Warwick is going to be permanently staffed. And then there's going to be Brooklyn still need for quite a while. So we'll be okay for a couple of years. We can figure things out. And then I think it was not even a month later when they came out with, actually, never mind. We're going to just completely simplify everything. And it was, in addition to getting rid of Brooklyn, it was cutting back on laundry, cutting back on food, cutting back on all those other services they provided. So they could just massively lay off Bethelites. And everybody went into panic mode. A lot of the people in my department that were the higher ups that I worked with, and the sisters too, were married to, they weren't like super heavy responsibility brothers, but they definitely were in a position where it was perfect for them to be laid off, because the idea started to become that if you'd been at Bethel for 5 to 10 years, you were an elder, maybe you were married, those were they called it perfect people to send out into the field because they could bring their Bethel experience with them. So if you fell into that 5 to 10 year range, and especially if you were an elder, it was kind of, a lot of the friends were freaking out with, we're next. There's no way that we're not going to be the next ones laid off.
And just piggybacking on from what Cliff was saying, I can imagine it being genuine fear in cases where you haven't had the opportunity to spread your wings.
Yeah.
You've moved from when you were a very young person and developed a dependency on Watchtower for your kind of day-to-day existence. So I can imagine it being a very anxious time.
Yeah. In fact, I can personally, it hits really home for me because my aunt and uncle were at Bethel for 25 years. My uncle went when he was 19 years old. They get sent home in 2009 was when they got sent to go be special pioneers, but they were just freaking out. They had no idea. They'd never lived outside of Bethel really in their entire adult lives. So that kind of hits home for me personally to see that fear that people had when they were told they had to leave Bethel.
And of course, there were videos on JW Broadcasting. I remember covering one of them in my rebuttals where they were spinning it to say, oh, look how blessed, look how much of a blessing it was to the other congregations. I think it was the South Africa branch that they were dealing with. But there's always another side to the story, you know. So Jordan, do you have another anecdote that you can share? And then we'll move back to Cliff.
Sure. I was kind of thinking another thing that was interesting about Bethel is they would always say that you would grow more in 1 year at Bethel than you would in 5 to 10 years of pioneering. And part of that was because you saw morning worship every day and all the programs that they have. But the other part had to do with counsel that you would receive, you know, quote unquote counsel all the time. And you get a lot of counsel from people, and you start to realize that a lot of it has to do with personal opinions rather than just Bible-based counsel. And I had 2 experiences that really kind of hit home with me for how silly sometimes this quote unquote counsel you would get. They have this rule about Bethel where when you're eating your the morning worship, where you shouldn't put anything in your coffee cup other than coffee or juice or water. And it was just, there's like a practical reason for it. But one morning I'm having morning worship and I wanted a little bit of the cereal that was served, but I didn't have a bowl. And I saw my other table mates were putting their cereal into their coffee cups and eating the cereal out of the coffee cup. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do that too. Everybody else is doing it. I knew that was a rule. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I saw everybody else doing it and I thought it'd be okay. And sure enough, my table head came and found me. I was just doing my work assignment during the rest of the day. He came and found me and he said, I want to talk to you for a couple of minutes. And I'm thinking, what the heck is he going to, you know, in the middle of the workday come to find me? What does he want to talk about? And that's what he came to counsel me about, was putting cereal into the coffee cup. And I was just thinking, I have like 50 bathrooms I have to clean today, and you're going to come and talk to me for 5 to 10 minutes about putting cereal in a coffee cup? It made no sense to me how silly that was. And then the other, and then the other experience I had about counsel was I was working night security in 2015, and one night I was really sick. I was so sick that I ended up having to take like half a bottle of Dayquil just to be able to stand up. And when you call out sick on nights, it really is, and the rest of the crew just suffers for it. So I thought, you know, I'm gonna take some medicine. I'm gonna power through. I'm gonna do what I can. Nights is pretty chill, so I could be able to get through the workday that night. And it was lunchtime, so we had about 30 minutes to an hour of just straight up downtime. And so I went and I laid down in the corner, and I kind of nodded off a little bit. And my overseer just randomly decided that was the night he was gonna come and see us at 3 o'clock in the morning to see how we were doing. And here he found me laying down in the corner, and I had a duty that morning. So here I was sick. I worked from 10 p.m. the previous night up until 8 a.m. the next morning. And he came and found me at 8 o'clock, and the same thing. He's like, can I talk to you for a couple minutes? And what he wanted to counsel me about was laying down on my shift. And I flat out told him, I said, I am so sick. I almost called out sick tonight. That's how sick I am. I had to take half a bottle of Dayquil just to be able to get through this night. And I'm a grown man. If I know that I need to lay down so that I can survive this night, I'm going to do it. And I just walked off. Never heard anything.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
It seems as though the need to kind of adhere to the kind of the letter of the law supersedes the need for simple basic compassion and the fact that, you know, we all slip up from time to time.
Yeah.
Almost as though just taking an opportunity to browbeat people just for the sake of it, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Cliff, do you have any stories?
So it's funny, this was not rehearsed with Jordan and I, but I feel like we're kind of going back and forth on some of the same subject matters, because that's exactly what I was thinking was counsel from the morning worship table. It sounds silly now, but So, you had your table head there, and he would be the one kind of responsible, I guess, along with the table foot, person sitting at the other end of the table, but the one responsible for keeping order, if you will, passing to the right. Let's all pass to the right. Let's all pass to the left. Like this whole little song and dance thing. And I remember, again, this was like when I had first gotten there, and it was after morning worship. I happened to be walking through the halls on my way to my work assignment, and I happened to run into my table head. And he's like, "Hey, Cliff, how are you adjusting, the pleasantries?" And then he sees a couch and he's like, let's sit down here for a second. And I'm like, well, he's probably just going to give you some encouragement, right? And what he tells me is, I used to tell this even as a Bethelite, I thought this was like kind of extreme. But he said, brother, you're doing a good job, but you're using a lot of napkins in the morning during breakfast. And, it's just... it's a little bit excessive, it's wasteful of dedicated funds. And he literally sat me. It was just a coincidence. There was like a counseling couch.
Did he have the numbers, like a form where he'd been keeping a record of how many napkins? Wow.
He's like, look at this chart right here on Monday. No, he didn't do that. But it was
the dramatic curve over.
Like, are you hiding a sin? We normally find that people use a lot of napkins when they're hiding. No, that part I'm adding. But it was, just things like that that was just kind of ridiculous. Like, out of everything that could be discussed, the amount of napkin, I'm sure I wasn't using like the whole package of napkins, but it was just kind of one of those things, So I think sometimes it would just be an effort to enforce some sort of rule, or maybe assert the authority. I don't think this was a bad guy, but I think that was just the culture of Bethel. Like, you would just get counseled just very randomly. I remember another occasion where I was sitting, and I may have shared this on your channel before, Lloyd, but I was hanging out with a guy that actually I have now interviewed on my channel because he's now out as well. But it was a Bethelite that had came in at the same time as me. And we were at lunch. And I guess I told a joke that could be considered off color or something like that. So, as we're leaving, this guy pulls out his Bible and he's like, we really have to be careful with the types of things that we're saying. And just that whole culture, as I said, of just, everyone trying to check one another, at different levels of authority and things of that nature. As a witness, you might say that you're kind of used to it, but I feel that at Bethel, it's just really heightened. Because everybody is just on alert, and especially with that additional level of the additional expectations, you could say, that are put on Bethelites.
It sounds like you say that it's part of the culture, and when you have everybody, multiple generations immersed in this hyper-vigilant, hyper-draconian, rule-obsessed culture, it's going to rub off, and it's just going to be the way things are done. I'm just it's triggering memories, this conversation of my 2 months when I was at MTS, because we were taught to think that being at MTS was like being at Bethel. We were part of Jehovah's organization for just those 2 months. So we held morning worship, and we had like a fairly regimented lifestyle during that period. And I was, quite frankly, one of the more boisterous members of the class. I was the one who was usually involved. If there was some kind of practical jokes going on, I was the one who would be interviewed as to whether I was involved or anything. And one evening, we were in the large auditorium, and there was an emergency megaphone at the back of the stage with an emergency announcement needed to be played. And I had some silly ringtones on my phone. Bear in mind, this was 2005. They were just kind of very simple ringtones. And I remember playing, I think it was the 18 ringtone over the emergency speaker, thinking that it would just come out in the auditorium. And then later realizing, no, this is for every room in the complex, including the instructor's office.
Oh, no.
So I got kind of, that's right. And I was due to be spoken to for counseling like the next day or something. And everyone was convinced that I would get completely and utterly battered for doing this. But I think that we had a very strict instructor and we had a very kind of lenient instructor. And I think it was the lenient instructor it was the strict instructor who'd been a circuit overseer for decades and decades. And he said, "Do you have anything you want to say, Lloyd?" So I said, "Oh, well, sometimes I can get a bit too carried away. I get a bit overexcited sometimes, and I do foolish things, and it's really, really terrible that I'm like that, and it's something that I really need to work on." And he just said, "Okay, I would agree with that. Anyway, next," sort of thing. But probably if I'd done that sort of thing in Bethel, from what you guys are describing, it would have been a completely different experience.
I would say definitely.
Yeah, I can almost think of an example or two or something similar to that happened, and the counsel that a person received on it. Yeah.
Wow. So we just have, the idea was that we do 3 stories each. So we've done 2 each so far. So Jordan, you're up next.
So I was thinking, we were talking about misconception of what Bethel is like earlier. I think what really drilled that home for me was, here I was 22 years old, got to go to Bethel for a 2-month assignment in July of 2013. And I had orientation my next day after arriving. And the very first thing the brother says, he's like, "We just want you guys to know, just because a person is a Bethelite doesn't make them good association." And I was just, what? How is that even possible? They're here at God's house, but you're going to tell me they might not possibly be good to association? And I was trying to think about an example to show of what Bethel could do to a person, when it occurred to me that my story about what kind of person I became when I was there at Bethel would kind of really drill this home. Because I had been there for 2 months in 2013, and then I went back for a year assignment in 2014. I got to be a coordinator in my department after only being there for 7 months. And there had been guys who'd been there for 5, 6 plus years who had never even touched any sort of privileges like that in the department. And almost immediately, I spent 2 weeks doing the training, and then I spent a week getting to do a little bit of the coordinating. And then the next Monday, the brother who trained me to be a coordinator took me aside, and he's like, "You know what? We think you're like better off. We're just going to leave you as a regular trainer." And it didn't occur to me until about a year later. I was having a conversation with somebody, and he said, "Yeah, we know why you got taken off being a coordinator." And he says to me, he's like, and pardon the language, he's like, "You were kind of turning into a bit of an a-hole." And I was just like, what? And so getting a little bit of privileges at Bethel so soon and being in that spiritual environment, I had started to think I was something special, to the point where all of my friends that I made in the department were avoiding me. I got privilege of being a coordinator, and it was taken away from me almost immediately, because that ego boost, kind of everything went to my head, and I started to become this person who was intolerable to be around. And I started asking some of my friends, I said, "Is it true that I started acting like this around this time frame?" They're, "Yeah, absolutely. We didn't want anything to do with you for a little while because you had turned into such an egotistical person."
And you feel that you were an egotistical person over that period?
No, I thought I was trying my best to be humble and learn my assignment. And I hated coordinating. It was ridiculous here I was 21 telling, sometimes 30-plus-year-old men what to do just because I had this title coordinator. But then looking back on it, it was like, oh yeah, I was acting like a jerk a lot of those times.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
And Cliff, do you have a final anecdote to share with us?
Yeah, this is kind of different than anything that I've shared up to this point. But so when you first get into Bethel, at least on a permanent assignment, and I'm not sure how it works on a temporary basis, but when you come in, they have entrance school, Bethel entrance school. And you experienced that as well, Jordan, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just this long course. I left Bethel almost 10 years ago, so some of the details are a little bit fuzzy. But it's this long course, it's intensive, like study program. You're studying parts of the reference Bible, and then you're also studying parts of the dwelling manual. So it's like you have the Bible, the publications, and then the Bethel Bible, which is the dwelling in unity manual. And some of those talks and courses, especially looking back now, were kind of disturbing. So there was one where it was maybe kind of Pillowgate in nature, if you will.
Wow, really?
If people are familiar with that video, if they're not, it's the video that recently came out about.
Bed linen.
I don't really know. Maybe you can word it in a better way than I can.
Ways that we can abuse Bedlin and various connotations of pornea, and how these are apparently manifesting themselves in God's house at the moment. So.
Exactly, with using pillows and
I'm
things.
sorry, I thought I had my old outline. I used to have my outlines until recently of the Bethel Entrance School, but I threw them away when I got kicked out of, or when I got disassociated.
Oh, okay.
I thought that'd been perfect if I had it.
Yeah. I can't remember, a lot of the specifics, but I remember this one that this guy named James Rayford. Does that name mean anything to you, Jordan?
Oh, yeah.
No,
Okay.
it doesn't.
That means something to me. He was.
Does it?
I think he was. Wasn't he like a senior guy who did talks as a Bethel representative?
Exactly. Yes, he went out and I think he was from my area. He was from the San Francisco Bay Area, if I'm not mistaken.
I've actually
really deep
used
voice.
I use a recording of one of his talks in one of my earliest videos about the 30 other lands, because he makes some interesting comments about how there are no witnesses. I think this was a talk from 2007 or something, but he said there are no witnesses in Afghanistan, Somalia, and North Korea, and I mentioned that point as part of my argumentation. Yeah.
Right, absolutely, and I think I have heard that referenced on your channel as well, Lloyd. But he was giving one of those entrance school talks. It was like after Watchtower studies, like on Monday night when you had the Watchtower study. After that, you had your Bethel entrance course or whatever. And there was one particular class where he was basically talking about all of the possible things that sometimes Bethelites come to Bethel with, that they've covered up, that they haven't like admitted. So, whether it's pornea or whatever, right? And he's giving this long, just very guilt-inducing type of talk. Even if you don't necessarily have something at the end of that talk, you came up with something that you had done, or something that you needed to get off your chest. And it wasn't bad enough. It wasn't enough that we would all come up with that on our own. But at the end of the talk, and this was like chilling to me, and thinking about it now is just very disturbing. But he said, every time I give this talk, I always have 6 or 7 brothers come up to me with something to confess. And he's like looking into all of our eyes, like, which one is it going to be? Right. And I was just like, and of course I came up with something. I'm like, yeah, I think when I was 3, I did, I'm like coming up with something I did, when I was younger, that I didn't reveal my Bethel application. But I just, even at the time, I was like, whoa, the idea that is given is basically, the idea that you're given of Bethel when you come in is Jehovah's Spirit is extra active here. So if there's anything that is uncovered, or if there's anything that's being hidden, like Jehovah is not going to allow it for any substantial length of time in his house. Mm-hmm. So I just remember after that, we weren't talking to each other about specifics, but everybody was kind of like, whoa, that was kind of deep, wasn't it? And everybody's like kind of nervous, with a nervous laughter talking about that. But I just thought that was so, especially now, I think it was so manipulative, and just a form of abuse, I think, to just do that and say, like, I know you're all hiding something, or I know at least 1/3 of you is hiding something, and hopefully you won't keep trying to fool Jehovah. I think that was the same talk.
When you say hiding something, are you talking something of a sexual nature?
Of a serious sin nature, but usually, it would have to do with something sexual. So the idea is it's something that maybe you've done throughout your life as a baptized Jehovah's Witness that may have been referenced on the application. Hey, has this ever happened, or have you ever been involved with this that you answered no to? And now that you're here in this place where Jehovah's Spirit is extra active, and you have people saying, are you sure you're not hiding something, basically? Are you sure there's not something that you need to tell us? And I remember there was another phrase that he used, and it was, when Jehovah taps you on the shoulder, don't ever flick his finger away. And that was kind of the same thing. Like, Jehovah's trying to get you. The idea is Jehovah, through this talk and through other things, is trying to get you to fess up to whatever it is. And again, there's nothing specific that has been done.
It sounds like he was trying to use some very strong psychology on his audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sure that's exactly what it was. But I know that phrase like tormented me throughout my whole Bethel life. And at the end of my Bethel life, I did come up with something that I needed to, talk about that eventually led to me, departing. But it was just very manipulative, and you really, I don't know. You just kind of get overwhelmed, I think, especially as someone newly coming in with the authority and power and extra Holy Spirit that these gentlemen are supposedly that they supposedly have.
Indeed. One thing that kind of is glaringly obvious from the Pillowgate videos, and I still remember watching them for the first time before I'd had a chance to do a rebuttal, and just being blown away by them and thinking, stop the press. I need to focus on this material. One thing that kind of really hits you, or at least hit me, was this naivety of thinking, well, we're going to ban people from being gay. We're going to ban people from getting married to non-Jehovah's Witnesses. We're going to ban people from having sex before marriage, and we're going to ban people from masturbating. And this naive assumption that that's not going to have a profound effect on Jehovah's Witnesses, especially in this highly regulated environment like Bethel. Are they really that naive?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And along those same lines, I was just going to add, this isn't like a separate story, but just along the lines of what you're talking about, you know how within Jehovah's Witnesses, there is a culture of snitching, of telling on one another when you're suspicious of some sort of sin. And I remember that being very prevalent and present at Bethel as well. If you saw, I don't want to get into too many just disturbing details just for the sake of it.
You don't want to name names. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But there were times where people were turning each other in for, hey, I think this guy was doing this to himself. He's my roommate, and I found a napkin, or just crazy stuff like that.
Like a pillow with feathers everywhere.
Right. Yes, with roses all over the pillow. Just very strange. Very strange.
A pillow with lipstick marks on it.
But it was so strange. Like, you're literally you're prepared and trained to be suspicious of one another, of what one another is doing. Like, so your roommate comes in and seems like he's had too much to drink, and you're prepared to tell him, hey, you need to talk to somebody or out. It's on another level. It feels in comparison with just general congregations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jordan, that it sounds like you've had similar experiences with the snitching culture.
Yeah, well, anybody who's seen my story video could attest to why that is such a big deal to me, is because I got kicked out of Bethel for a similar kind of a thing. But when I was telling my friends why I was leaving, I saw that same look on their face that I'd had a couple of times, where you just know I'm also having a sin that I'm hiding that would get me kicked out of Bethel, but I can't go tell the elders because I don't want to get kicked out of Bethel. Right. But it was like we'd have department meetings where they would just be all, so this is how much a person's had to drink, like a glass of wine, a beer, and a shot. Who's had more to drink? And they're just constantly instilling in these people, like, if you see your roommates having more to drink, more alcohol than he should be, you should tell the elders about it, or make him tell the elders about it. Or that, like Cliff was saying, that snitching environment at Bethel is even more prevalent than it is in a typical congregation.
And I was just to piggyback on that very briefly, as far as alcohol specifically, I mean, at Bethel, that's the order of the day, right? You're in this place. Most people feel guilty about something. They're somewhat miserable, trying to act like they're happy. Alcohol is the thing. Everybody's drinking. Culture. And
so they're self-medicating on alcohol, you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you, Cliff? Sure. Because one of the funny stories about Bethel, alcohol culture at Bethel, is the Wednesday before Gilly graduation, is the special meeting. You've had, you already shaking your head. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. That was the
strangest thing, but feel free if you want to share it. That was so strange to me.
So Wednesday before Gilly graduation, there is a special Gilly meal where it's only the Bethelites, only the Gilead students are allowed to go to it. And they go all out. They make like steak that they slaughter their own cows and make steak out of, or some other fancy meal. But they let you off work about 20 minutes early. Normally it's 12 o'clock. It's 11:40 that you get off work. So you have time to go prepare, do whatever you want to get ready for this meal. And everybody, literally from the lowliest Bethelite all the way up to governing body, do this thing where somebody will have a bottle of wine or some other spirits or who knows what. And they'll invite 3 or 4 people over to their room or to their office to go and have a drink. And like I said, every Bethelite does this, where they'll have 1 or 2 or even sometimes 3 drinks right before the special Gilead graduation meal.
So
And it's
you're
like,
saying that when we watch those Gilead graduations, which are now part of the JW broadcasting episodes, basically everyone's sloshed?
that happens the Wednesday, not right before Gilead graduation
Oh,
itself.
right, okay.
It's Wednesday,
It's not
right
moments
before.
the.
No,
Right, okay.
no.
So they're not sloshed. I
No,
just
they're
had
not
this
sloshed
picture
at
in my
Gilead.
head that I thought that might explain a few things. But yeah, that's fascinating because obviously in my book I cover a little bit about Rutherford and how under his presidency there was this drinking culture.
Mm-hmm.
And even though alcohol is really clamped down on in the Dwelling Together in Unity book, as you guys will know, it sounds like it's still, this culture still managed to keep its claws in, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the worst part is you have 19 and 20-year-old men who show up, and in the United States, the drinking age is 21. And so they have 2 years where they're watching all their friends participate in this drinking culture that they can't participate in. And then one of the things that gets people kicked out is giving alcohol to an underage person too. So
Right.
it's just, the drinking culture is talk about misconceptions about Bethel, you know?
Sure. So this has just been absolutely fascinating. I got much more than I bargained for. So I'm really appreciative to you both. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask both of you. I mean, you guys have got fantastic YouTube channels, and I'm going to be putting links in the description below for anyone who, for whatever reason, is unaware of you so far. But you've shared quite a lot of your stories already as to the reasons why you ended up eventually leaving behind the Jehovah's Witness religion entirely. And what I want to ask both of you now is, to what extent did your experience in Bethel factor into your decision to leave the religion?
I think we lost Cliff. I think he got disconnected. So maybe I can start off while he's trying to get reconnected.
Okay, sure.
So honestly, I have nothing, probably about 95% positive memories about my time at Bethel. There were definitely some really bad experiences and definitely some like, this should not be happening at Bethel experiences. But for the most part, I really enjoyed my time there. It wasn't until I started waking up to the truth about the truth and I started to connect the dots, because there was things that I saw happen at Bethel that at the time you write off as just being, oh, this is Jehovah's, and you know, it's this perfect organization, but it's run by imperfect men. But then you start to realize, well, no, Jehovah's not running the organization. It's actually just men being men, and the politics. And that was the biggest thing to me, was seeing the politics play out at Bethel. When it's under the guise of being Jehovah's Holy Spirit directed, that's one thing. But then when you realize it's just a boys' club, that's when you start to realize that Bethel is nothing more than just, you know, a really, really, really fancy boys' club is all it is. So looking back on my experiences definitely started to help, but it didn't, in and of itself, it didn't actually cause me to wake up.
No, it was more, I know it was far more complicated, but from what you're telling me, it sounds as though when you were ready to look behind the curtain, you'd already seen a bit more behind the curtain than most ordinary witnesses.
Yeah. In fact, I remember at Pioneer School, because I went to Pioneer School before I went to Bethel, the brother said, if any of you ever had the chance to go to Bethel, you're going to see even governing body members, branch committee members making really big mistakes. And it's going to be up to you to realize Jehovah's in charge here and not to let those things stumble you out of the organization. And I saw, like, I have stories that I could share, you know, for days about mistakes I saw men make, and especially, you know, like governing body members and branch committee members. So looking back on it, yeah, you start to see there's nothing special to it. It's just another man-made organization.
Wow. And Cliff, I think we lost you momentarily. Thankfully, you've managed to regain control of the internet. But we're just wrapping up. Jordan has just shared his response to my question, which is, although you had lots of reasons for leaving behind Jehovah's Witnesses, to what extent did your experience in Bethel factor into your conscientious decision to part ways with Jehovah's Witnesses?
Oh, definitely. I hope I'm not just repeating what Jordan said, but I think when you do get to that point, see, as a Jehovah's Witness, we ignored and we tried to ignore so many things. So in a congregation setting, you could say, well, at least I'm sure that maybe at this level of management, if you will, of the organization, everything's a lot better. Yeah, they're imperfect, whatever that means, right? They're imperfect, but I'm sure that it's a lot better. Everything's a lot more by the book and things of that nature. So when I started having my questions and I reflected and I said, basically, I've been to the top in a manner of speaking. I've seen what could possibly be that mysterious, majestic thing that I couldn't really define. And I've seen that it's very flawed. And I've seen the people taking charge, and I've seen egos, and I've seen decisions being made that are supposedly for these spiritual reasons, that even at the level that I was at Bethel, which was not extremely high per se, but I could see that these were not, there was no spirituality behind this. It could have been some frivolous reason just based on someone's opinion or, you know, anything of that nature. So when you're able, and that's why I think that it is no coincidence that people who have reached some of these higher levels within the organization can kind of come to it faster. And some of the people come to that conclusion faster that it's not true. And some of the harshest critics and the most aggressive apologists are those who have not seen any of that, because it still has that mystique. And so in their mind, it is what they imagine it to be. But people like us, including you, Lloyd, who's seen the MTS level and different things of that nature, you can kind of see where the top is, and you're not fooled anymore by it.
Yeah, I think particularly, not so much MTS, but certainly the year that I spent as an elder, when things did start to unravel, they probably unraveled faster, because I'd seen for myself how flawed and corrupt things were at the elder level. So I could basically extrapolate how bad things would be in the organization once I started to read Crisis of Conscience. Do you think that if every Jehovah's Witness had the knowledge that you guys have of how things are done at Bethel, do you think it would be easier for them to wake up?
Well, Jordan, I was going to defer to you. Or were you asking me, Lloyd? Sorry.
I'm asking both of you. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. You're much more eloquent than I am, Cliff. So why don't you get us going?
This is not the strong-minded, kind of arrogant person you were painting of before, Jordan. So you clearly humbled yourself a great deal.
Yeah, he's become a much better person since leaving Bethel. No. Well, I want to say yes, but in all honesty, not every Bethelite has woken up.
True.
By the same token. And there's some people who I do believe can continue to drink the Kool-Aid, as it were, even at very high levels. Like I'm not the type that believes that everybody knows that this is nonsense and that it's manipulation and a high control. I think that even when you see what you see, I was able to do it at Bethel. I was able to act like everything was fine and it just be like, yeah, I saw that brother cuss out that other brother who just dropped a magazine on the machine. But that was just that one. I'm sure that never happens. I think you can do that at any level. That said, because it does kind of precipitate it, or make it the process go a little bit faster once you're able to reflect on those experiences, I do think that it's a net positive, if you will, as far as potentially helping people to wake up and come to the right conclusion.
Jordan, do you think that people at Bethel are perhaps dealing with more cognitive dissonance than the average Jehovah's Witness?
Yeah, they absolutely have to be, because like, Cliff was saying, you see all this stuff going on and yet you continue to just push it aside. You think, oh, this is still Jehovah's organization. It's still Jehovah's perfect organization. And what I was thinking about specifically is that I would tell my mom was the one person that I would open up to about some of the negative things I was experiencing at Bethel. And she just refused to listen to it. She said, no, there's absolutely no way that stuff is going on. It's not as bad as you're making it out to be. And then when I did wake up to the truth about the truth, I was trying to subtly plant doubts to people and tell them, they would talk about Bethel and I'd say, oh, actually, I was at Bethel. I can tell you it's not quite as amazing as you think it is. And then I was just about ready to leave the organization completely, and my parents went to visit Warwick, and they come home from their visit to Warwick, and they're telling me all these positive experiences, and I would just tell them, it's not exactly like that. They're just putting on the best face. You should actually see the behind the scenes. So being able to actually experience it, yeah, it helps a lot of people, but I think that cognitive dissonance just really still kicks in with, so many you don't see Bethelites leaving in droves of a personal choice. But I do know of at least 2 Bethelites who woke up. One was reading the Proclaimer's book. He was, doing his assignment on night security, reading the Proclaimer's book, and he realizes that there's no way Jehovah's One true organization could have such a messed up foundation. And he got off nights and went home, and then has left the organization since. So you never know what can wake up a person, I think.
That's absolutely true. If I could add one more thing, I just realized. So my father, he actually did. I was saying he did 2 weeks. It almost sounds like prison or something. But he went to Bethel for 2 weeks. And this was actually right as I was going through my toughest period of depression and doubt. So it's just kind of coincidentally. But my dad went to Bethel for 2 weeks because he's in the flooring trade. And as they were in Warwick, I guess, doing some of the construction at the end of 2015, he was helping out with that. And I remember talking to him. I was like FaceTiming him or Skyping him after he had been there for a week. And he was telling me, again, you don't go too far with your explanations about what's going on there. But he was even saying, in his way, it's not exactly what I thought it would be. It wasn't really what I expected. Some of the attitudes it's still Jehovah's organization. I know Jehovah's, but it's, he was pretty thrown off by what he saw there. So that's why I say, I think at some level, it does mess with you. It does kind of potentially steer you in that direction. It just depends on how strong your defenses are, so to speak, to pull yourself back into that. And that'll determine whether you're able to free yourself of it mentally or not.
Fascinating. Well, guys, you've certainly given me more than I bargained for. And I know you in particular, Cliff, were doubting whether you could come up with too many anecdotes, but you've treated us to many, which have, along with Jordan's, given us a real picture of what it's like inside Jehovah's house of Bethel. And this, viewers, if you've noticed, is part 1 of what I hope to be a series where I interview various Bethelites, and I can't think of a better way of getting this series underway than with you guys. So thank you, Jordan and Cliff, for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Lloyd. It's really good to get these experiences out there.
Indeed.
Thanks a lot, Lloyd, and definitely a pleasure to be on with you, Jordan, as well. I'm just starting to watch your channel, so it's amazing what you're contributing to the XJW community as well. So,
well, thank you. You both are personal heroes of mine, so it's amazing for me. I'm just starstruck here, sitting talking with you both. So,
so viewers, while we have a team hug off camera, I'll close the video. Again, guys, it's just been brilliant. So thank you for joining me, and viewers. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the John Cedars channel to see more videos like this. But for now, thank you so much for watching.